The digital clock on the battered bedside table blinked 3:58 a.m. I didn't wait for it to strike 4. I reached out in the freezing darkness of our cramped bed-stuy apartment and switched the alarm off before it could make a single sound. Habits forged in the barracks of Naval Station Norfolk do not simply vanish because the uniform is packed away in a cardboard box at the top of a closet. Your body remembers the discipline. Your mind remembers the mission. And for the past 12 years, my mission had been sleeping quietly in the twin bed just a few feet away from me. I sat up, the cold air biting at my exposed shoulders, and swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. The floorboards creaked softly under my weight. I moved with practiced silence, navigating the narrow hallway toward the kitchen without turning on a single light. I knew exactly where everything was. The kitchen smelled faintly of old radiator dust and bleach. I flicked on the small fluorescent bulb above the sink. It hummed, flickering twice before casting a harsh, pale glow over the chipped laminate counters. I pulled a clean glass from the drying rack and reached for the heavy plastic canister of specialized nutritional powder. Making Elijah's morning formula wasn't just breakfast, it was a tactical operation. Precise measurements, exact temperatures. The right combination of supplements to keep his muscles from breaking down faster than nature intended. I picked up the measuring spoon. As I reached deep into the canister to scoop the powder, the sleeve of my faded thermal shirt slid up toward my elbow. The light caught my skin. There it was, located on the inner side of my right forearm, exactly 5 centimeters below the elbow. It was a small, monochrome black tattoo, no larger than 4 centimeters across. The ink had faded slightly over the years, settling deeply into the skin, but the image remained unmistakable, a vertical dagger piercing directly through the spread wings of a falcon. I didn't stare at it. I didn't pause to run my fingers over the black lines. You don't stare at a memorial every time you walk past it. You simply carry its weight and keep moving. I poured the powder into the warm water and began to stir. The metal spoon clinked rhythmically against the glass. Clink, clink, clink. I picked up the glass and walked back down the hallway, pushing open the door to Elijah's bedroom. He was 7 years old, but his body was fighting a war he had never enlisted for: Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It is a coward of a disease. It doesn't strike all at once. It steals a child's strength silently, ounce by ounce, day by day, targeting the muscles until walking becomes a battle and breathing becomes a chore. I set the glass on his nightstand and knelt beside the bed. "Morning, soldier," I whispered, gently rubbing his shoulder. Elijah stirred, his dark eyes blinking open sleepily. He offered a small, tired smile. "Morning, Mom. Time to work," I said softly. There was no room for pity in this apartment. Pity is a civilian luxury. Pity makes you weak, and weakness was something neither of us could afford. I pulled the blankets back and began his morning physical therapy routine. I placed my hands on his thin ankles, slowly rotating the joints. Then, I moved to his hamstrings, gently extending his legs to keep the muscles from contracting and tightening overnight. He winced slightly as I pushed his left knee toward his chest. "Breathe through it, Eli," I instructed, my voice calm, steady, and immovable. "Pain is just information. Acknowledge it, process it, and push past it." He nodded, biting his lower lip, and took a slow, deep breath. While I worked on his limbs, my mind automatically ran the numbers. It was a mental calculation I performed every single morning, a daily audit of our survival: $6,500. That was the exact cost of Elijah's medical care every month. The experimental therapies, the specialized equipment, the out-of-pocket specialists. 40%. That was all the insurance company covered. They sent polite, sterile letters printed on heavy cardstock, explaining their coverage limitations, while implicitly telling me that my son's life was a statistical write-off. The remaining 60% was a gaping hole in our defenses. It was thousands of dollars I had to manifest out of thin air every 30 days. I didn't cry over the math. I didn't curse the insurance companies or scream at the ceiling. When you are trained to operate behind enemy lines, you do not complain about the lack of reinforcements. You assess the terrain, you identify the objective, and you execute the mission with whatever weapons you have left. "Good job today, buddy," I said, finishing the last stretch and pulling him into a seated position. I handed him the glass of formula. "Drink it all, we have to move." By 5:30 a.m., Elijah was bundled into his thick winter coat, a scarf wrapped securely around his neck to protect his lungs from the brutal Brooklyn chill. I carried his backpack, heavy with medical supplies and school books, over my shoulder. We walked down the narrow, creaking hallway of our apartment building and knocked on door 4B. It opened immediately. Mrs. Higgins stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on a metal cane. She was a 60-year-old retired Army nurse who had served in Desert Storm. She had eyes that saw right through the polite bullshit of the world, and a heart hardened into pure steel. "Got him, Carter," she said gruffly, stepping aside to let Elijah walk in. "His medication schedule is in the front pocket," I said, my tone strictly professional. "Therapy at 1400 hours. I'll pick him up at 1800. Mrs. Higgins didn't offer a sweet motherly smile. She offered a single sharp nod of respect. It was the silent communication of veterans. "Your VIP is secure. Go do your job." I turned and walked down the stairs, stepping out into the freezing, dark streets of Bed-Stuy. The walk to the subway was a blur of gray concrete and icy wind. I descended into the underground station, swiped my card, and boarded the G train. The carriage was mostly empty at this hour. Just exhausted night shift workers and the invisible laborers who keep the city running while the wealthy sleep. The train rattled and screeched as it hurled itself under the East River, transporting me from the struggling, worn-down streets of Brooklyn into the towering, glittering fortress of Manhattan. Stepping out onto the streets of the financial district felt like landing on a different planet. Here, the buildings were monoliths of glass and steel, piercing the sky like giant spears of arrogance. The wealth was suffocating. I walked 3 blocks to the service entrance of the high-rise maintenance company. The locker room smelled of industrial cleaner, damp nylon, and cold coffee. It was loud, filled with men shouting over each other, cursing about the weather and the freezing wind. I didn't participate in the banter. I walked straight to my assigned locker, opened the metal door, and began my preparations. I stripped off my heavy winter jacket, remaining in my faded thermal shirt and cargo pants. I reached into the locker and pulled out the heavy, reinforced canvas safety harness. I stepped into the leg loops first, pulling the thick straps upward and securing the heavy steel buckles tightly against my thighs. I pulled the chest rig over my shoulders. Every movement was precise, mechanical, and deliberate. As I reached across my chest to lock the primary load-bearing carabiner, I realized the thick sleeves of my thermal shirt were bunching up under the harness straps. I paused. I reached down and rolled the sleeves of my shirt up tightly toward my biceps, making room to adjust the heavy protective arm guards we wore to prevent the ropes from burning our skin. As the fabric rolled up, the harsh buzzing fluorescent lights of the locker room struck my bare arms. There it was again. The black ink. The vertical dagger piercing the wings of the falcon. It stood out starkly against my skin under the brutal artificial lighting. A permanent, silent reminder of a life that ended 12 years ago in the desert dirt of the Middle East, and a promise that remained unfulfilled. I strapped the arm guards over it, securing the Velcro tightly, burying the falcon under layers of industrial canvas. A younger guy a few lockers down, a new hire who still looked terrified every time the wind blew, glanced over at me as I tightened my helmet strap. "You're taking the east face of the Bennett building today, right?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "10th tier? That's 100 stories up, Maya. The wind advisory says it's going to be brutal up there." I didn't look at him. I simply checked the locking mechanism on my ascender. People always asked me why I chose to do this. Why a single mother would willingly hang suspended from a half-inch nylon rope, dangling hundreds of feet above the concrete pavement, with nothing but open air beneath her boots. They didn't understand the mathematics of survival. Washing windows on the 100th floor paid exactly 3 times of what I could make scanning barcodes in a warehouse or cleaning office toilets. 3 times the money meant I could cover the 60% the insurance company refused to pay. It meant Elijah breathed easier. And as for the danger, as for the terrifying, dizzying height, when you have jumped out of military transport planes into hostile, completely blacked out airspace, when you have held a folded flag while a commanding officer tells you that the man you loved did the right thing, when you have watched your child struggle to take a single step across a living room floor, fear becomes entirely relative. A 100-story skyscraper wasn't a death trap to me. It was just a very tall, very quiet wall. And I was going to conquer it, inch by inch, because failure was simply not an operational option. I grabbed my heavy utility bucket, locked my carabiners, and walked out toward the service elevator. The battle for the day had officially begun. The wind at 1,200 feet does not merely blow. It hunts. It sweeps off the gray expanse of the Atlantic, tearing through the concrete canyons of Manhattan, searching for anything fragile enough to break. Up here on the flat, sprawling roof of the towering skyscraper, the noise was a constant, deafening roar. I stood near the edge of the eastern parapet, the sky above me an endless bruising canvas of charcoal gray. Click. The sound of the heavy forged steel carabiner locking into the anchor point of the motorized scaffolding was sharp and metallic. A tiny, insignificant noise against the howling wind, yet it was the only sound that mattered. It was the sound of my life insurance policy. I gave the primary safety line a sharp, brutal downward yank. It held fast, no give, no hesitation. I gripped the cold metal railing of the suspended platform and stepped off the solid roof, lowering myself into the narrow aluminum cage. There is always a fraction of a second when gravity realizes you have left the earth, a sudden, weightless drop in the pit of your stomach. Most people would panic. Most people would squeeze their eyes shut and grip the rails until their knuckles bled. I simply exhaled, a slow, measured breath, letting my heart rate settle into a flat, rhythmic cadence. Panic is a civilian luxury. When you have spent years operating in hostile territories, jumping into pitch-black drop zones, you learn to treat fear not as an enemy but as a compass. It keeps you sharp, it keeps you alive. I reached for the heavy, weatherproof control box attached to the rig's railing. I engaged the descender. The electric motors whined, a low, grinding vibration that vibrated through the soles of my heavy work boots. The platform shuddered, detached from the safety of the roofline, and began its slow, agonizing crawl down the sheer glass face of the 100th floor, the east face of the building. I unhooked my utility bucket from the inner rail. The water inside was already freezing, a mixture of heavy-duty ammonia and industrial soap. I dipped my sponge applicator into the dark blue liquid. The water bit into my skin through my insulated gloves, a sharp, stinging reminder of the reality I was suspended in. A light, freezing rain began to fall. The drops hit the massive glass panels like tiny, icy bullets, streaking the perfectly mirrored surface. The wind picked up, catching the underside of the aluminum platform. The rig swayed violently, drifting nearly 2 feet away from the building before slamming back against the rubber bumpers with a dull, heavy thud. Mini-drama, the physical toll and the discipline. I didn't scramble for the railing. I didn't gasp. I widened my stance, bending my knees slightly to absorb the kinetic shock, locking my core into solid iron. My hands, calloused and scarred from years of tactical training, moved with mechanical precision. I pressed the heavy sponge against the glass of floor 100, dragging it across the massive pane in a wide, sweeping arc. The thick, soapy water cut through the city grime. Then came the squeegee. Squeak. The rubber blades sliced the water away, pulling it downward in a flawless, straight line, leaving nothing but absolute, transparent perfection in its wake. The physical exertion burned immediately in my shoulders. The muscles in my upper back screamed in protest against the freezing wind. Pain is just information, I reminded myself, keeping my jaw locked. Acknowledge it, process it, push past it. Floor 99. The rig descended with a mechanical groan. The rain was heavier now, soaking through the outer shell of my waterproof jacket, creeping its icy fingers down the back of my neck. I dipped the sponge again. The repetitive motion was almost hypnotic. Swipe, squeegee. Wipe the blade, repeat. Suddenly, a massive crosswind ripped around the corner of the building. The gust was so violent it tipped the heavy bucket of soapy water. I lunged forward, my forearm slamming hard against the metal railing to pin the bucket in place before it could spill over the edge. The impact sent a sharp, vibrating shockwave up my arm. I hissed quietly through my teeth, leaning my entire body weight against the railing to stabilize the swinging platform. The rig slowly settled. The wind died down to a low, threatening hum. I stayed pinned against the rail for a moment, catching my breath. I tilted my head back, looking straight up into the endless, weeping gray sky. The freezing rain washed over my face, mixing with the sweat on my forehead. I didn't wipe it away, I just let it fall. I reached up with my right hand to adjust the heavy, soaked collar of my jacket, pushing the thick, wet fabric of my thermal sleeve up past my elbow to free my range of motion. As the sleeve rolled back, the skin of my inner forearm was exposed to the brutal, gray light of the storm. There it was. The black ink stood out in stark, absolute defiance of the cold, the vertical dagger piercing clean through the spread wings of the falcon. The rain hit the tattoo, making the dark lines gleam. Lend the third reveal. I stared at the falcon for a long, silent moment. 12 years. 12 years since David had bled out in the sand of a country most people couldn't point to on a map. 12 years since I had been handed a folded flag and a sterile, classified excuse for why my husband was never coming home. He did the right thing. I pulled my sleeve back down, covering the ink, burying the ghost dust of my husband back under the heavy, wet canvas of my uniform. I'm doing the right thing too, David, I thought, gripping the squeegee. I'm keeping him breathing, whatever it takes. Floor 98. Mini drama, the glass barrier, platform halted. I turned my attention back to the massive pane of glass in front of me. As I pressed the sponge against the window, the soap cleared slightly, giving me a pristine, unobstructed view into the interior of the building. It was a completely different universe. Inside, the lights were a warm, inviting amber. The office was sprawling, lined with dark mahogany bookshelves and plush, cream-colored leather sofas. The climate control system must have been running perfectly. I could almost feel the dry, luxurious warmth radiating from the other side of the glass. A man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit was standing near a massive mahogany desk. He was holding a steaming ceramic mug of coffee, laughing at something on his computer monitor. A woman in a pristine white silk blouse walked past him, carrying a stack of files, her face completely relaxed, completely safe. They were existing in a world where the biggest danger was a spilled cup of coffee or a missed quarterly projection. I pressed the rubber blade of my squeegee against the glass. Squeak! The sound was muted, muffled by the inch-thick hurricane-proof glass that separated my reality from theirs. The man in the suit suddenly turned his head. He looked straight toward the window. Straight toward me, my hands stopped. The squeegee hovered in mid-air. For a fraction of a second, I thought he saw me. I thought he saw the woman suspended 1,000 feet above the concrete, fighting the freezing rain to wipe the dirt off his expensive view. But he didn't. Because the lighting inside the office was brighter than the gloomy storm outside, the glass acted as a perfect one-way mirror. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at himself. He raised his free hand and carefully adjusted the knot of his silk tie, using the very window I was washing to perfect his reflection. He smoothed his collar, gave himself a satisfied, confident nod, and then turned his back, walking away to sit on the plush leather sofa. He had looked right through me. I was completely, utterly invisible. I didn't feel a surge of bitter resentment. I didn't slam my fist against the glass in frustration. Anger is an emotion that requires you to believe the world is supposed to be fair. A soldier knows the world is never fair. I simply watched him walk away. You enjoy your warmth, I thought, my face impassive, my breathing steady. I have a war to fight. I pulled the squeegee down, clearing the last streak of water from his perfect polished mirror. Floor 97. Floor 96, the descent continued. The cold seeped deeper into my boots. My hands, despite the heavy gloves, were beginning to ache with a dull, throbbing numbness. But the rhythmic, mechanical nature of the work kept my mind locked in a state of absolute, tactical focus. Every window I cleared was another fraction of a medical bill paid. Every floor I descended was another day of experimental therapy for Elijah. The executives inside these glass boxes were building corporate empires. I was building a barricade against a terminal disease. My stakes were infinitely higher. As the motorized platform ground its way down toward the 95th floor, the wind suddenly shifted direction, carrying with it a sharp, biting squall of heavier rain. I leaned my weight against the railing, bracing for the impact. The rig shuddered violently, the metal cables groaning under the immense strain. I didn't close my eyes. I kept them wide open, staring straight ahead at the dark, reflective glass of the skyscraper. I watched my own reflection suspended in the storm. A 38-year-old widow, a single mother, a former special operator, hanging by a thread in the sky. I tightened my grip on the squeegee until my knuckles ached. I wasn't just surviving the storm, I was staring it down. And as the rig slowly descended toward the massive panoramic windows of the 100th floor executive suites, toward an office that belonged to a man named Marcus Bennett, I had absolutely no idea that the glass barrier separating my invisible world from their untouchable one was about to completely shatter. Silence, when purchased for $1 billion, has a very specific texture. Inside the sprawling 100th floor executive suite of Bennett Defense Technologies, the silence was absolute. The climate-controlled air was perfectly calibrated. The thick imported wool carpets absorbed every stray echo. Outside the floor-to-ceiling hurricane-proof glass, a violent winter storm was battering Manhattan. Yet inside there was only a serene, untouchable stillness. Marcus Bennett, 52 years old, and the architect of one of the most powerful defense contracting empires in the world, sat at the head of a massive mahogany table. Scratch, scratch. The sound of his platinum fountain pen moving across the heavy watermarked paper was the only noise in the room. He dotted his signature, completing the final authorization on a federal contract that would inject over $1 billion into his company's valuation. Around him, a team of highly paid corporate attorneys and government liaisons exhaled in collective relief. Someone politely clapped. A lawyer in a sharp gray suit leaned forward, beaming. "Congratulations, Mr. Bennett. This secures the company's dominance for the next decade." Marcus slowly placed the cap back onto his pen. The metallic click was soft yet authoritative. He looked at the signed document, then at the smiling faces around him. "Thank you, gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice a low, steady baritone that commanded immediate respect. "Please leave the binders with my assistant on your way out. I'd like a moment alone." The men nodded eagerly, packing away their briefcases and filing out of the suite with hushed, celebratory whispers. When the heavy double doors finally clicked shut, the cavernous office was empty once again. Marcus remained seated for a long moment. He looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a titan, a man who possessed the power to shift global markets with a single phone call. Yet, as he stared at his palms, a familiar hollow ache expanded in the center of his chest. He felt entirely, profoundly empty. He had just secured his legacy, but the victory tasted like ash. Success had a way of amplifying the ghosts you tried to outrun. And Marcus had been running for 12 years. He pushed his chair back and stood up. He bypassed the celebratory bottle of scotch, resting on the wet bar, and instead walked over to a small private alcove near the far wall of his office. This section of the room held no framed magazine covers, no photographs with politicians, no gleaming corporate awards. It was completely bare save for a single unassuming black frame mounted at eye level. Inside the frame was a simple charcoal sketch. The paper was slightly yellowed, the lines drawn by Marcus's own unsteady hand in a hospital bed over a decade ago. It depicted a vertical dagger, piercing directly through the spread wings of a falcon. Marcus reached out and gently rested his fingertips against the cold glass of the frame. He closed his eyes, and instantly, the pristine silence of his office vanished, replaced by the phantom echoes of a nightmare he could never fully escape. 12 years ago, he had been a younger man, an ambitious contractor touring a newly constructed facility in the Middle East. Then came the ambush, the kidnapping, the suffocating terror of being held captive in a crumbling, lightless compound. And finally, the pitch-black chaos of the night the Special Forces operators had breached the walls to extract him. He had survived because a shadow in tactical gear had thrown himself over Marcus's body, absorbing the catastrophic, lethal force of a fragmentation grenade. Marcus didn't know the soldier's name. The operation had been highly classified, a ghost mission erased from official records. When Marcus had finally awakened in a military hospital, the government liaisons had refused to provide any details. Classified. The operator did his job. "Move on with your life, Mr. Bennett." But Marcus couldn't move on. How do you balance a ledger when your very heartbeat is a debt owed to a dead man? He had founded the Bennett Foundation, funneling millions of dollars into veteran support and anonymous military family aid programs. To the public, it was an act of extreme corporate philanthropy. In reality, it was a 12-year desperate manhunt, a billionaire utilizing every resource at his disposal to find the family of the ghost who had saved him, guided by only one clue. The image burned into his retinas in the blinding flash of the grenade explosion. The black ink tattooed on the inner forearm of the soldier who had shielded him. The dagger and the falcon. 12 years of searching. 12 years of dead ends, redacted files and closed doors. 12 years of waking up in a multi-million-dollar penthouse, suffocated by the guilt of a life purchased with another man's blood. Marcus let out a long, heavy sigh. He dropped his hand from the frame, turning his back to the sketch. He walked over to the wet bar, picked up a heavy crystal glass, and poured himself some ice water. He needed a distraction. He needed to look at something other than the ghosts of the past. He walked toward the sprawling, floor-to-ceiling windows that dominated the eastern wall of his office. Outside, the storm that had battered the city all morning was finally beginning to break. The oppressive, bruised clouds were fracturing. Suddenly, a blinding razor-sharp shaft of golden sunlight pierced through the gray overcast, striking the glass of the skyscraper at a dramatic, slanted angle. The light was harsh, illuminating the dust particles floating in the pristine air of his office. Marcus took a sip of his water, looking out over the sprinkling infinite grid of Manhattan. And then a shadow descended from above. The low, mechanical whine of industrial motors vibrated faintly against the reinforced glass. An aluminum scaffolding platform lowered into his field of vision, coming to a halt directly outside his window, a window washer. Marcus didn't turn away. He stood perfectly still, watching with mild, detached curiosity, Outside the glass, suspended 1,000 feet above the concrete, was a woman. She was bundled in dark, soaked industrial winter gear. The sheer violence of the wind whipped her safety harness against her thighs, but her movements were entirely devoid of panic. She operated with a brutal mechanical efficiency. Swipe, squeegee, clear. Marcus watched the rhythmic, disciplined motion of her arms. There was something almost hypnotic about it. A quiet, stoic dignity in the way she attacked the glass, completely unfazed by the terrifying void beneath her boots. He took another sip of his water, preparing to turn back to his desk, but then the woman shifted her stance. She reached high above her head, pressing the rubber blade of her squeegee against the uppermost corner of the pane. The heavy waterproof canvas jacket she wore shifted with the movement. The faded thermal sleeve underneath, which had been rolled tightly up toward her bicep, was suddenly exposed to the elements. At that exact fraction of a second, the shaft of golden sunlight cutting through the clouds hit the glass dead on, brilliantly illuminating the woman suspended outside. The light fell directly onto her bare inner forearm. Marcus's eyes casually tracked the movement, but as his gaze brushed past her skin, his heart physically stopped. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the thick imported wool carpet with a dull, heavy thud, splashing ice water across the toes of his expensive leather shoes. He didn't notice. He didn't feel the cold water. He didn't feel his own lungs burning for oxygen. His eyes were locked, paralyzed on the skin of her forearm. There, illuminated perfectly under the harsh, piercing beam of sunlight, separated from his face by less than an inch of reinforced glass, was a black monochrome tattoo. A vertical dagger, piercing directly through the spread wings of a falcon. The spilled ice water seeped silently into the imported wool carpet beneath Marcus's expensive leather shoes. He didn't move, he didn't breathe. For a man who had built a global defense empire by calculating risks and anticipating every possible variable in a fraction of a second, Marcus Bennett was entirely paralyzed. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and strategy, was short-circuiting, struggling to process the impossible image hovering just inches away from his face. It was the tattoo, the vertical dagger, piercing directly through the spread wings of a falcon. It wasn't a similar design. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the exact, precise insignia that had been branded into his nightmares and etched into his waking thoughts for 4,380 days. The same monochrome ink he had seen in the blinding, chaotic flash of a fragmentation grenade in a crumbling Middle Eastern compound. The same symbol he had paid private investigators millions to track down, only to be met with heavily redacted military files and closed doors. And now, the answer to a 12-year, desperate manhunt was suspended outside his 100th floor office window, wielding a squeegee in the middle of a winter storm. Slowly, as if moving through deep, heavy water, Marcus stood up. His legs felt unsteady, stripped of the commanding presence that usually dominated corporate boardrooms. He didn't take his eyes off the woman's forearm. He was terrified that if he blinked, if he looked away for even a microsecond, the harsh sunlight would shift, the storm would swallow her, and the ghost would vanish back into the ether from which she had suddenly appeared. He took one step toward the massive panoramic window, then another. He was drawn forward by a gravitational pull far stronger than the earth beneath him. It was the gravity of a blood debt. He stopped when the toes of his shoes touched the baseboard. The floor-to-ceiling hurricane glass was all that separated his climate-controlled, billion-dollar sanctuary from the brutal, freezing reality she was enduring outside. Marcus slowly raised his right hand. His fingers were trembling visibly. He pressed his palm flat against the thick, cold glass. It was an instinctive, desperate gesture. An unconscious attempt to reach through the barrier, to physically grasp the tether to his past before it could slip away again. The glass was freezing, transferring the biting chill of the Manhattan storm directly into his skin. Outside, hovering 1,000 feet above the concrete, Maya felt a subtle shift in the light. When you spend your life operating in hostile environments, your peripheral vision becomes highly attuned to movement. A shadow had displaced the amber glow coming from inside the executive suite. Maya paused her rhythmic wiping. The heavy soapy sponge hovered an inch from the pane. She slowly lifted her head. Through the soap streaks and the freezing rain, her dark, piercing eyes locked directly onto the man standing inside. 4 eyes met through the thick, impenetrable glass. The collision of 2 entirely different universes. Marcus felt the breath catch in his throat. He looked into her face, expecting to see the hardened, aggressive glare of a tactical operator. But the woman staring back at him did not look like a soldier preparing for war. She looked like a woman who was already in the middle of one, fighting it with a quiet, devastating stoicism. Her face was wet with rain and sweat, her breath plumed in small white clouds against the freezing air, yet her dark eyes were perfectly, terrifyingly calm. They held a depth of discipline and dignity Marcus recognized immediately. It was the unmistakable, unyielding gaze of a warrior who had been stripped to the bone and refused to break. Marcus's mouth opened slightly. He wanted to speak. He wanted to shout through the glass, to ask her name, to demand answers about the man who had traded his life for a billionaire's survival. His hand pressed harder against the pane, as if trying to push his voice through the molecular structure of the building. But Maya didn't know him. To her, the man in the sharp charcoal suit, staring at her with wide, haunted eyes, and his hand pressed against the glass like a desperate child, was nothing more than an eccentric executive. He was just another wealthy suit occupying a climate-controlled tower, completely detached from the brutal arithmetic of her reality. She did not offer him a polite smile. She did not wave. She did not display a single ounce of subservience or awe at his opulent surroundings. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, establishing a silent, unmovable boundary of absolute equality. Her eyes communicated a single profound truth. You may own the building, but I own myself. Then, with smooth mechanical precision, Maya broke the eye contact. She turned her attention back to the glass. She raised her squeegee and pulled the rubber blade down the pane, effectively wiping away his reflection and shutting him out of her world. Marcus stood frozen against the window. He watched her resume her work with the relentless, disciplined efficiency of a machine. She was treating the discovery of his lifetime with the mundane indifference of a Tuesday morning chore. He didn't move. He couldn't. He was anchored to the spot, watching the living embodiment of his survivor's guilt meticulously scrub the dirt from his ivory tower. Outside, the wind howled, violently shaking the aluminum rig. Maya widened her stance, effortlessly absorbing the kinetic shock, her core locked tight. She finished the final section of the 100th floor pane. Before engaging the motorized descender to move down to the 99th floor, Maya hooked her squeegee onto her utility belt. She checked her waterproof digital watch, 10:15 a.m. It was time for her sanctioned 3-minute mid-shift break. Suspended 1,000 feet in the air, battered by freezing rain and aggressive crosswinds, Maya did not pull out a thermos of coffee. She did not rub her aching, freezing hands to generate warmth. She reached into the inner, waterproof pocket of her heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a rugged, battered smartphone. Inside the office, Marcus watched closely, his hands still pressed against the glass. He saw her peel off one of her thick, insulated gloves, exposing her raw, reddened fingers to the freezing air. She dialed a number with practiced speed and lifted the phone to her ear. Ring, ring, miles away in a cramped, warm apartment in Bed-Stuy, Mrs. Higgins handed the phone to a frail 7-year-old boy resting on a worn sofa, a specialized breathing apparatus resting on the table beside him. Mom, Elijah's voice crackled through the phone's tiny speaker, weak but bright. High above Manhattan, surrounded by the deafening roar of the storm, Maya's stoic, hardened expression instantly transformed. The fierce, impenetrable armor of the former Navy SEAL melted away, replaced by the profound, radiant tenderness of a mother. "Hey, buddy," Maya said, her voice raising slightly to compete with the wind, but carrying a warmth that defied the freezing temperature. "Just checking in. How was the physical therapy with Mrs. Higgins?" "It was okay," Elijah replied, coughing softly. "My legs hurt a little bit today. But I did the stretches like you said. I breathed through it." Maya closed her eyes for a brief second, swallowing the sharp, familiar spike of pain in her chest. $6,500 a month. That was the price of keeping the pain at bay. "Good job, soldier," she said, opening her eyes, her gaze fixing on the gray horizon. "I'm proud of you. You're the toughest guy I know." "Are you at work, Mom?" Elijah asked. "Is it scary up there today?" "It's raining really hard here." Marcus, watching from the other side of the glass, saw her lips curve into a gentle, reassuring smile. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read the universal language of her posture. The way she hunched her shoulders slightly to shield the phone from the wind. The way her harsh features softened. "Scary?" Maya let out a light, effortless laugh, completely dismissing the fact that a sudden mechanical failure would send her plummeting to a gruesome death. "Not at all, Eli. It's just a little water. Your mom doesn't get scared of rain. I'm just taking care of the mission, getting things squared away for us." She didn't complain about the biting cold. She didn't mention the ache in her shoulders or the numbness in her fingers. She didn't breathe a word about the suffocating pressure of the medical bills. She preserved her dignity, wrapping her son in a protective shield of absolute confidence. "Okay," Elijah said, his voice trusting and innocent. "I love you, Mom. I love you more, buddy. I'll be home at 1800 hours. Be ready for dinner." "Yes, ma'am." Maya lowered the phone. She ended the call and carefully placed the device back into her waterproof pocket, sealing the debit tight. She took a slow, deep breath of the freezing air. The brief moment of maternal softness vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The armor locked back into place, her jaw set, her dark eyes hardened, refocusing on the brutal reality of the glass and steel in front of her. She pulled her insulated glove back onto her freezing hand, gripping the heavy rubber squeegee once more. Inside the office, Marcus Bennett stood utterly transfixed. He had just witnessed a profound, silent masterclass in human resilience. He had spent his morning negotiating with billionaires, politicians, and generals, men who demanded the world bend to their comfort. Yet, none of them possessed a fraction of the raw, unyielding fortitude of the woman hanging outside his window. She wasn't begging for help. She wasn't cursing her fate. She was fighting a solitary, desperate war, suspended between the heavens and the concrete, with a quiet dignity that humbled him to his core. And on her arm, she bore the mark of the man who had bought Marcus's life with his own. Marcus watched as Maya reached for the heavy control box on the rig's railing. She didn't look at him again. She didn't care about the billionaire staring at her. She pressed the button, engaging the motorized descender. The aluminum platform groaned against the wind, shuddered, and began its slow, agonizing crawl down toward the 99th floor. Marcus watched her descend until her dark canvas jacket disappeared from his view, leaving nothing behind but a perfectly clean, flawless pane of glass. For a second, the office was deadly quiet again. Then the paralysis broke. Marcus stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the wet carpet. He didn't care. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violent, frantic urgency. He didn't walk back to his desk. He didn't press the intercom to call his assistant. He broke into a sprint. The billionaire CEO of Bennett Defense Technologies ran across his opulent, 100th floor office, throwing open the heavy double doors with enough force to shatter the quiet professionalism of the executive corridor. He had spent 12 years searching for a ghost. He was not going to let her vanish into the storm. Time does not stop during a catastrophe. It shatters into a million microscopic fragments. Inside the sprawling, climate-controlled sanctuary of the 100th floor executive suite, the heavy crystal tumbler slipped from Marcus Bennett's fingers. It hit the imported wool rug with a dull, muffled thud, splashing ice water across the pristine toe of his Italian leather shoe. He didn't flinch. He didn't breathe. The billionaire CEO, a man who navigated global defense contracts and hostile corporate takeovers without blinking, was entirely and completely paralyzed. His mind, normally a fortress of calculated logic, was short-circuiting. Just inches away, suspended outside the hurricane-proof glass in the middle of a brutal Manhattan winter storm, was the answer to a 12-year nightmare. The golden shaft of sunlight had struck the window washer's bare inner forearm, illuminating a stark monochrome black tattoo, a vertical dagger, piercing directly through the spread wings of a falcon. It wasn't a similar design. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the exact precise insignia he had sketched from memory in a military triage hospital 12 years ago. It was the same image he had framed and hung on the wall of his office, a daily, punishing reminder of the ghost who had traded his life for Marcus's. For over a decade, Marcus had funneled millions into his foundation, employing private investigators to search classified military channels, hunting for the family of the operator who had shielded him from a fragmentation grenade. Every lead had turned to ash, every door had been slammed shut by redacted government files, and now the ghost had manifested outside his window, wielding a squeegee against the freezing rain. Marcus stood up slowly. His legs felt hollow, stripped of the commanding authority that usually dominated his boardrooms. His eyes remained locked onto the ink on the woman's arm, terrified that if he blinked, the sunlight would fade. The storm would swallow her, and the hallucination would end. He moved toward the massive, panoramic window with the agonizing slowness of a man approaching an altar. He was drawn forward by a gravitational pull far stronger than the earth beneath him, the inescapable gravity of a blood debt. He stopped when the tips of his shoes touched the baseboard. The thick pane of glass was the only barrier separating his billion-dollar, artificially warmed universe from the freezing, lethal reality she was enduring outside. Marcus slowly raised his right hand. His fingers were trembling visibly, a violent contrast to his sharp-tailored suit. He pressed his palm flat against the cold glass. It was an instinctive, desperate gesture. An unconscious attempt to reach through the molecular structure of the building, to physically grasp the tether to his past before it could slip away again. Outside, suspended 1,000 feet above the concrete arteries of the city, Maya Carter felt a subtle disruption in her peripheral vision. When you spend your life operating in hostile, unpredictable environments, your senses become hyper-tuned to anomalies. A shadow had displaced the ambient amber glow emanating from the executive suite. Maya paused her rhythmic wiping. The heavy soapy sponge hovered an inch from the pane. She slowly lifted her head. Through the soap streaks and the driving rain, her dark, piercing eyes locked directly onto the man standing inside. 4 eyes met through the thick, impenetrable glass. The ultimate collision of 2 entirely different worlds. Marcus felt the breath catch violently in his throat. He looked into her face expecting to see the hardened, aggressive glare of a tactical operator. But the woman staring back at him did not look like a soldier preparing for a firefight. She looked like a woman who was already in the middle of a war, fighting it with a quiet, devastating stoicism. Her face was wet with freezing rain and sweat, her breath plumed in small white clouds against the frigid air. Yet her dark eyes were perfectly, terrifyingly calm. They held a depth of discipline and dignity that Marcus recognized immediately. It was the unmistakable, unyielding gaze of a warrior who had been stripped to the bone but absolutely refused to break. Marcus's mouth opened slightly. He wanted to speak. He wanted to scream through the glass, to demand her name, to ask how she was connected to the man who had died in the dirt so that Marcus could live in the sky. His hand pressed harder against the pane, his shoulders tense with desperation. But Maya didn't know him. To her, the man in the charcoal suit, staring at her with wide, haunted eyes and his hand pressed against the glass like a desperate child, was nothing more than an eccentric executive. He was just another billionaire occupying a climate-controlled tower, completely detached from the brutal arithmetic of her daily survival. She did not offer him a polite smile. She did not wave. She did not display a single ounce of subservience, awe, or curiosity regarding his opulent surroundings. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, establishing a silent, immovable boundary of absolute equality. Her eyes communicated a single profound truth: you may own this skyscraper, but I own myself. Then, with smooth, mechanical precision, Maya broke the eye contact. She turned her attention back to the glass. She raised her squeegee and pulled the rubber blade down the pane, effectively wiping away his reflection and shutting him out of her world. She continued washing the window with ruthless, disciplined efficiency, completely ignoring the billionaire standing inches away. Marcus stood frozen, his hand still anchored to the window. He watched her operate with the relentless precision of a machine. She was treating the most monumental discovery of his lifetime with the mundane indifference of a Tuesday morning chore. Outside, the wind howled, violently shaking the aluminum rig. Maya widened her stance, effortlessly absorbing the kinetic shock, her core locked tight. She finished the final section of the 100th floor pane. Before engaging the motorized descender to move down to the 99th floor, Maya hooked her squeegee onto her utility belt. She checked her waterproof digital watch. It was time for her sanctioned mid-shift break. Suspended 1,000 feet in the air, battered by freezing rain and aggressive crosswinds, Maya did not pull out a thermos of coffee. She did not rub her aching, freezing hands to generate warmth. She reached into the inner, waterproof pocket of her heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a rugged, battered smartphone. Inside the office, Marcus watched closely, his breath fogging the glass. He saw her peel off one of her thick, insulated gloves, exposing her raw, reddened fingers to the biting cold. She dialed a number with practiced speed and lifted the phone to her ear. Ring, ring, miles away in a cramped, warm apartment in Bed-Stuy, Mrs. Higgins handed the phone to a frail 7-year-old boy resting on a worn sofa, a specialized breathing apparatus resting on the table beside him. Mom? Elijah's voice crackled through the phone's tiny speaker, weak but unmistakably bright. High above Manhattan, surrounded by the deafening roar of the storm, Maya's stoic, hardened expression instantly transformed. The fierce, impenetrable armor of the former Navy SEAL melted away, replaced by the profound, radiant tenderness of a mother. "Hey, buddy," Maya said, her voice raising slightly to compete with the wind, but carrying a warmth that defied the freezing temperature. "Just checking in. How was the physical therapy with Mrs. Higgins? It was okay, Elijah replied, coughing softly. My legs hurt a little bit today. But I did the stretches like you said. I breathed through it. Maya closed her eyes for a brief second, swallowing the sharp, familiar spike of pain in her chest. $6,500 a month. That was the price of keeping the pain at bay. Good job, soldier, she said, opening her eyes, her gaze fixing on the gray, weeping horizon. I'm proud of you. You're the toughest guy I know. Are you at work, Mom? Elijah asked. Is it scary up there today? It's raining really hard here. Marcus, watching intently from the other side of the glass, saw her lips curve into a gentle, reassuring smile. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read the universal language of her posture. The way she hunched her shoulders slightly to shield the phone from the wind. The way her harsh, tactical features softened into absolute devotion. Scary? Maya let out a light, effortless laugh, completely dismissing the fact that a sudden mechanical failure would send her plummeting to a gruesome death. Not at all, Eli. It's just a little water. Your mom doesn't get scared of rain. I'm just taking care of the mission, getting things squared away for us. She didn't complain about the biting cold. She didn't mention the agonizing ache in her shoulders, or the numbness in her fingers. She didn't breathe a single word about the suffocating pressure of the medical bills, or the sheer terror of her environment. She preserved her dignity, wrapping her son in a protective shield of absolute, unyielding confidence. Okay, Elijah, it's his voice, trusting and innocent. I love you, Mom. I love you more, buddy. I'll be home at 1800 hours. Be ready for dinner. Yes, ma'am. Maya lowered the phone. She ended the call and carefully placed the device back into her waterproof pocket, sealing the zipper tight. She took a slow, deep breath of the freezing air. The brief moment of maternal softness vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The armor locked back into place, her jaw set, her dark eyes hardened, refocusing on the brutal reality of the glass and steel in front of her. She pulled her insulated glove back onto her freezing hand, gripping the heavy rubber squeegee once more. Inside the office, Marcus Bennett stood utterly transfixed. He had just witnessed a profound, silent masterclass in human resilience. He had spent his morning negotiating with billionaires, politicians, and generals. Men who demanded the world bend to their comfort and complained when their private jets were delayed. Yet, none of them possessed a fraction of the raw, unyielding fortitude of the woman hanging outside his window. She wasn't begging for help. She wasn't cursing her fate. She was fighting a solitary, desperate war, suspended between the heavens and the concrete, with a quiet dignity that humbled him to his core. And on her arm, she bore the mark of the man who had bought Marcus's life with his own. Marcus watched as Maya reached for the heavy control box on the rig's railing. She didn't look at him again. She didn't care about the billionaire staring at her. She pressed the button, engaging the motorized descender. The aluminum platform groaned against the wind, shuddered, and began its slow, agonizing crawl down toward the 99th floor. Marcus watched her descend until her dark canvas jacket disappeared from his view, leaving nothing behind but a perfectly clean, flawless pane of glass. For a second, the office was deadly quiet again. Then the paralysis broke. Marcus stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the wet carpet. He didn't care. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violent, frantic urgency. He didn't walk back to his desk. He didn't press the intercom to call his assistant. He didn't care about the billion-dollar contract resting on his mahogany table. He broke into a sprint. The billionaire CEO of Bennett Defense Technologies ran across his opulent, 100th floor office, throwing open the heavy double doors with enough force to shatter the quiet professionalism of the executive corridor. He sprinted toward the private elevator banks, hammering the call button with the desperate intensity of a man whose life depended on it. He had spent 12 years searching for a ghost. He was not going to let her vanish into the storm. The high-speed executive elevator plummeted toward the ground floor of the Bennett Defense Technologies Tower. 99, 95, 80, 70. The digital numbers flashed above the polished steel doors in a rapid, silent countdown. Inside the cab, Marcus Bennett stood entirely alone. The smooth, frictionless descent of the elevator made his stomach drop, but it was a completely different kind of freefall that was currently paralyzing his mind. He closed his eyes, pressing the palm of his hand hard against his forehead. He was trying to stay in the present, trying to focus on the marble and steel of his Manhattan empire. But the image of the woman outside his window, the quiet, stoic face battered by freezing rain, and the stark black ink on her forearm, had violently ruptured a dam inside his memory. The sterile hum of the elevator shaft faded. The scent of imported leather and expensive cologne dissolved. Suddenly, Marcus was no longer breathing the filtered, temperature-controlled air of a billionaire. He was choking on the suffocating, copper-scented dust of a crumbling stone compound halfway across the world. 12 years ago. The memory did not return as a cohesive narrative. It hit him in jagged, visceral fragments, the agonizing bone-deep ache in his wrists from being bound to a rusted radiator for 6 days. The taste of sand and dried blood in his mouth. The absolute, suffocating darkness of a windowless cell in a hostile territory, waiting for an execution he knew was inevitable. Marcus hadn't been a soldier. He had been a defense contractor, a civilian who had ventured too far out of the green zone, relying on a false sense of corporate invincibility. He had learned very quickly that millions of dollars in a bank account could not stop a bullet in the desert. Then came the breach. There was no cinematic warning, no dramatic speeches, just the sudden earth-shattering concussive blast of C4 ripping the heavy wooden door completely off its hinges. The darkness of the cell was instantly fractured by the blinding, strobing beams of tactical flashlights. Through the swirling clouds of pulverized plaster, shadows moved with terrifying, lethal precision. They were operators, phantoms in night vision goggles and heavily armored tactical gear, sweeping the room in absolute disciplined silence, targets secured. Moving to extract. The voice was low, distorted by a comms headset, but Marcus remembered the profound physical relief that washed over him when strong hands grabbed his shoulders, hauling him to his feet. An operator stepped in front of him, positioning his heavily armored body as a human shield between Marcus and the doorway. "Keep your head down and stay on my vest," the operator commanded, pulling Marcus toward the exit. They made it as far as the ruined courtyard. The air outside was thick with the smell of cordite and burning diesel. Marcus was disoriented, stumbling over debris, utterly dependent on the nameless soldier guiding him through the chaos. And then a sound cut through the gunfire, clink, clack. It was a small, hollow, metallic noise bouncing against the broken concrete floor. Time, which had been moving at a frantic, adrenaline-fueled pace, suddenly dilated. It slowed down until every microsecond felt like an eternity. Marcus looked down. Rolling to a stop less than 3 feet away from them was a fragmentation grenade. The human brain cannot fully process impending death in real time. Marcus stood completely frozen, his muscles locked in a state of absolute terror. He was a billionaire CEO, a man who commanded thousands of imlitses, but in that fraction of a second he was utterly helpless. But the operator did not freeze. The soldier didn't dive for cover. He didn't scramble backward. He didn't hesitate for a single mathematical millisecond. With the fluid, instinctual muscle memory of a man who had accepted his own death, long before he put on the uniform, the operator lunged forward. He didn't just push Marcus out of the way. He threw his entire body over the billionaire, driving Marcus hard into the dirt and collapsing his armored chest directly over the explosive. Boom. The blast was not a sound. It was a physical catastrophic force that ruptured the air itself. A blinding, white-hot flash of light obliterated the darkness of the courtyard. The sheer concussive pressure knocked the oxygen out of Marcus's lungs, rattling his teeth and instantly deafening him with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. He was pinned beneath the crushing, dead weight of the operator. In that microsecond of brilliant, terrifying illumination of the explosion, Marcus's eyes were forced wide open. The operator's tactical sleeve had been shoved violently upward toward the elbow by the force of the tackle. Just inches from Marcus's face, illuminated by the flash of the grenade that was currently ending a man's life, was a patch of exposed skin on the inner forearm. And stamped into that skin, rendered in stark monochrome black ink, was a symbol, a vertical dagger, its blade driven straight down, piercing through the center of a falcon with spread wings. It was the last thing the operator ever showed the world. A second later, the blinding light vanished, plunging the courtyard back into darkness and dust. The heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on Marcus's chest went entirely, permanently limp. The silence that followed the explosion was the heaviest thing Marcus had ever felt. It was the crushing, insurmountable weight of a debt that could never ever be repaid. A man, a husband, a father, a son, had traded his final breath so that Marcus Bennett could take his next. Ding. The soft, cheerful chime of the executive elevator snapped Marcus violently back to the present. His eyes flew open. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving against his tailored suit, his hands trembling violently. The polished steel doors slid open, revealing the sprawling, pristine expanse of the ground floor lobby. The transition from the blood-soaked memory of the Middle East to the gleaming marble of Manhattan was jarring, but the adrenaline surging through his veins overrode the shock. Marcus burst out of the elevator. "Mr. Bennett, sir, we were just about to," a senior vice president began, stepping forward with a leather portfolio. Marcus completely ignored him. He didn't even look at the executives gathered near the reception desk. He broke into a dead sprint across the lobby, his leather shoes slapping loudly against the marble. He headed straight for the Central Security and Building Maintenance Concourse. The head of building operations, a burly man monitoring a bank of screens, looked up in alarm as the Billionaire CEO vaulted over the low security partition, bypassing protocol entirely. "Mr. Bennett, what's going on?" the manager asked, standing up quickly. "The east face rig," Marcus ordered, his voice raw, breathless, and carrying an absolute terrifying authority. "The window washing scaffolding on the east face. Where is it?" The manager blinked, utterly confused by the CEO's frantic interest in building maintenance. It's currently descending, sir. Should be around the 80th floor by now. The wind advisory is getting worse, so they're taking it slow." "Halt it," Marcus commanded, leaning over the console, his eyes wide and desperate. "Halt the descent immediately. Bring that rig down to the ground-level plaza. Do not let her stop at a service floor. Bring her all the way down to the street, right now." "Sir, standard protocol during a storm is to dock at the nearest mechanical tier." "I don't give a damn about standard protocol," Marcus roared, his voice echoing off the marble walls of the lobby, silencing every employee in the vicinity. It wasn't the anger of a demanding billionaire. It was the desperation of a man who had just found a ghost. "Bring that rig down to the ground. Now." "Yes, sir. Bringing it down to the plaza," the manager stammered, frantically typing on his keyboard to override the automated systems. Marcus didn't wait to watch the screens. He spun around and sprinted toward the revolving glass doors at the front of the lobby. He burst out onto the concrete plaza. The freezing rain immediately soaked his expensive suit. The brutal Manhattan wind whipped against his face, stinging his skin. He ignored the cold. He ignored the confused stares of the pedestrians huddled under umbrellas. He walked out into the center of the open plaza, tilting his head back, letting the freezing rain wash over his face as he stared straight up the towering, sheer glass face of his own building. High above, creeping slowly down through the gray, weeping sky, was the small aluminum cage. Marcus Bennett stood perfectly still in the storm, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He crossed his arms over his chest, shivering, yet completely immovable. He had waited 12 years. He could wait the 5 minutes it would take for the rig to reach the ground. The ghost of the man who had saved him had finally sent a messenger. And Marcus was going to stand in the freezing rain until she arrived. The first indication that the operational parameters had changed was the sudden, jarring halt of the motorized scaffolding. Suspended around the 80th floor, the aluminum cage shuddered violently against the freezing wind. I immediately reached for the primary control box, my thumb hovering over the emergency brake. But before I could engage the manual override, the digital display flashed a harsh, blinking red. "System. Ground control initiated." I frowned, my dark eyes scanning the glowing panel. The rig began to descend, but not at the slow, methodical pace required for washing. It was dropping continuously, bypassing the service tiers, making a direct, uninterrupted descent toward the ground-level plaza. I tapped the comms unit in my ear. "Skyline Dispatch, this is Carter on the east face. My rig is being overridden from the ground. Confirm safety protocols." Static crackled in my ear for a moment, before the voice of my site manager came through, sounding uncharacteristically flustered. "Carter, yeah, copy that. Just write it down. Building security bypassed our system. The CEO of Bennett Technologies personally ordered the rig to the ground." I didn't ask questions. You don't waste breath on variables you cannot control. I simply widened my stance, locked my knees to absorb the swaying motion of the cage, and kept my eyes fixed on the horizon as the concrete of Manhattan rose up to meet me. I assumed there was a VIP security threat, a lockdown, a structural emergency. What I did not expect was the scene waiting for me at the bottom. The heavy aluminum rig touched down onto the polished granite of the Bennett Building's private plaza with a dull, echoing clank. The freezing rain was still falling in gray, diagonal sheets, biting into the concrete and turning the plaza into a slick, icy mirror. I reached up and methodically unclasped the heavy steel carabiner from my chest harness. I didn't rush, the storm did not dictate my pace. My training did. I stepped out of the cage, my heavy work boots hitting the solid ground. I reached down to unbuckle my thigh straps, and that was when I saw him. He was standing less than 20 feet away, dead center in the middle of the open plaza. He was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that was currently being ruined by the relentless downpour. He had no umbrella. He wore no overcoat. The freezing rain plastered his silver hair against his forehead and soaked his expensive jacket right through to his shoulders. Behind him, huddled under the awning of the glass revolving doors, a half-dozen security guards and executives watched in terrified confusion. One of them held an umbrella, looking desperately as if he wanted to step out and shield his boss, but an invisible, impenetrable boundary kept them all at bay. The billionaire wasn't looking at his security detail. He wasn't looking at the storm. He was looking directly at me. I finished unbuckling my harness, letting the heavy nylon straps fall away. I maintained my posture, spine straight, shoulders squared, chin perfectly level. Even soaked in rain and smelling of industrial ammonia, I carried the unyielding, stoic dignity of an operator who refused to be diminished by anyone or anything. Marcus Bennett took a step forward. Then another. He closed the distance between us, his leather shoes splashing carelessly through the freezing puddles. As he drew nearer, I conducted a rapid tactical assessment of the man. His breathing was shallow and erratic. His hands, clenched at his sides, were visibly trembling. But it wasn't the cold making him shake. It was absolute, overwhelming adrenaline. He stopped barely 3 feet away from me. Up close, I could see the profound, haunted depth in his eyes. He didn't look at me like a billionaire looking at a blue-collar worker. He looked at me with a raw, agonizing reverence. The rain battered both of us, a chaotic symphony of wind and water, sealing us off from the rest of the world. Marcus stared at my face for a long, silent moment. Then, his gaze dropped to my right arm. The sleeve of my heavy canvas jacket had fallen back into place during the descent, burying the ink under layers of waterproof fabric. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ragged, trembling whisper that barely cut through the noise of the storm. "Which unit?" The question struck me like a physical blow. Which unit? Civilians do not ask that question. Corporate executives do not ask that question. It is a specific, targeted inquiry belonging entirely to a world of classified briefings, blackout drops, and closed-casket funerals. My tactical instincts instantly flared, slamming down a defensive wall of absolute ice around my emotion. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked straight into the eyes of the billionaire, my expression hardening into an impenetrable fortress. "I work for Skyline Maintenance, sir," I replied, my voice smooth, respectful, but entirely devoid of warmth. "If there is an issue with the exterior cleaning protocol, you can contact my dispatcher." I moved to step around him, treating the interaction with the strict, disciplined boundaries of a professional contractor. Marcus stepped sideways, blocking my path. He didn't do it aggressively. He did it desperately. "Please," he breathed, the word cracking in the middle. He raised his hand, gesturing vaguely toward my right arm, though he didn't dare touch me. The sheer respect radiating from his posture was undeniable. He was treating me not as an employee, but as an equal, or perhaps as a superior. "I saw the ink," Marcus said, his voice shaking violently now. The rain dripped from his jaw, but his eyes never wavered from mine. "The dagger. And the falcon. I saw it." My heart, which had maintained a flat, steady rhythm throughout the terrifying descent, suddenly skipped a beat. I locked my jaw. The military protocol ingrained deep in my marrow dictated absolute operational security. You do not confirm insignia. You do not discuss the ghosts of past deployments. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," I said coldly, my dark eyes narrowing into twin points of obsidian. I stood my ground, radiating a fierce, quiet dignity. I might have been a struggling single mother living in a cramped bed-stuy apartment, but I was not a woman who could be interrogated or intimidated. Marcus shook his head frantically. The billionaire facade had completely vanished, leaving behind only a man stripped bare by 12 years of agonizing survivor's guilt. "I've been looking for you," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a choked, tear-filled whisper. "Or someone like you. For 12 years. 12 years. The number hung in the freezing air between us, suspending the laws of time and physics. My breath caught in my throat. My tactical defenses, the impenetrable armor I had worn every single day since the military liaison knocked on my door, began to experience a profound seismic tremor. My mind, trained to process thousands of variables in a microsecond, began to connect the fragmented data points. 12 years ago, the Middle East. A classified extraction mission with zero official details, a defense contractor. I looked at the towering, glass and steel monolith of Bennett Defense Technologies rising into the storm clouds above us. I looked at the man standing in front of me, soaked to the bone, weeping quietly in the rain. The pieces snapped together with a terrifying, devastating clarity. David hadn't died taking a hill. He hadn't died holding a strategic checkpoint, the classified hostage extraction, the high-value target who had been pulled from the rubble. It was him. The man standing in front of me was the reason my husband never came home. A lesser woman would have broken. A lesser woman would have collapsed onto the freezing concrete, screaming at the injustice of the universe, demanding to know why the billionaire was breathing while the soldier was buried in the ground. A lesser woman would have unleashed a decade of financial terror, grief, and lonely nights in a tidal wave of hysterical tears. But I was not a lesser woman. I was Maya Carter. I was a warrior, and I was the wife of a warrior. I absolutely did not cry. I straightened my spine, pulling myself up to my full height. The coldness in my eyes vanished, replaced by a fierce, piercing intensity that burned right through the rain. I did not look at him with hatred. I looked at him with the solemn, heavy weight of judgment. "Who are you?" I asked sharply, my voice cutting through the wind like a surgical blade. Marcus swallowed, the tears mixing freely with the rain on his face. He didn't wipe them away. He stood before me, completely vulnerable, offering his identity as if surrendering a weapon. "Marcus Bennett," he answered quietly. "Bennett." I nodded slowly, a microscopic, almost imperceptible movement of my head. The name echoed through the deepest, most heavily guarded vaults of my memory. David had mentioned that name years ago, in the quiet, hushed conversations we shared in the dark before a deployment. He had talked about defense contractors, about the executives who moved through war zones in armored convoys. I remembered the night the officers came to my door. I remembered the folded flag. I remembered the heavy, suffocating silence of the sterile briefing room, where they refused to give me any details of my husband's final moments. "He did the right thing," the commanding officer had told me, his face carved from stone. "That is all we can say. He did the right thing." For 12 years I had held on to those words. I had repeated them to myself in the dark when Elijah's medical bills piled up on the kitchen table. I had whispered them into the freezing wind while hanging 1,000 feet above the city. He did the right thing. And now, 12 years later, I was looking directly into the eyes of the man my husband had deemed worthy of his final breath. Two human beings. A struggling single mother from Brooklyn and a billionaire CEO from Manhattan. We had existed in the very same city, breathing the very same air, separated by only a few miles of concrete and an impenetrable wall of classified military silence. We had been orbiting each other for over a decade, entirely unaware that our lives were anchored to the exact same ghost. "He was my husband," I said, my voice incredibly soft but carrying an immovable, devastating weight. "Sergeant David Carter." Marcus closed his eyes. A ragged, agonizing sob tore itself from his throat. Hearing the name, a name he had searched for, prayed for, and agonized over for a decade, broke the last remaining barrier of his composure. He didn't reach out to touch me. He simply bowed his head, standing in the freezing rain, the billionaire titan completely humbled before the widow of his savior. "He saved my life," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "They threw a grenade into the room." I was frozen. I couldn't move. He didn't even hesitate. He threw himself over me. He took the blast. I only saw his arm. I only saw the ink. Marcus lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine. The sorrow in his gaze was infinite. "I tried to find him," Marcus pleaded, his voice breaking. "I hired investigators. I set up foundations. The government redacted everything. They scrubbed his unit from the operation reports. I didn't know his name. I didn't know if he left behind a family. I have lived every single day of the last 12 years trying to find out who bought my life." I listened to him in absolute silence. I looked at his expensive, ruined suit. I looked at the luxury skyscraper towering behind him. I thought about the grueling, agonizing mornings I spent calculating whether I could afford the heating bill, and Elijah's specialized formula in the same week. There was a profound cosmic irony in the situation. My husband had traded his life for a man who possessed limitless resources, while his own son was fighting a terminal illness on a fraction of an insurance payout. But I didn't feel bitter. Bitterness is the luxury of those who feel defeated. I had never been defeated. "He made a tactical choice," I said evenly, maintaining my absolute dignity. David swore an oath. "He honored it. He didn't do it for a reward, Mr. Bennett. He did it because he believed that a life is a life, and the mission comes first." I took a slow, deliberate breath, the freezing rain washing over my face. "I don't need your pity, sir," I continued, my dark eyes boring into his soul. "And I don't need your guilt. My son and I have survived. We fight our own battles. We don't ask for charity." Marcus shook his head, his eyes burning with a fierce, absolute clarity that matched my own. The billionaire wasn't looking down at me. He was looking up to me. "I am not offering you charity, Mrs. Carter," Marcus said, his voice finding a solid, unshakable bedrock amidst the storm. "And I would never insult a woman of your caliber with pity." He stood a little taller, wiping the rain from his eyes. The respect radiating from him was profound, authentic, and absolute. He was not a savior stepping in to rescue a helpless widow. He was a man seeking permission to honor a debt that could never truly be repaid. "I am a man who was granted a second chance at life by a hero," Marcus said quietly, the words carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "And I have spent 12 years waiting for the opportunity to ensure that his legacy is honored the way it deserves to be." I held his gaze. The freezing rain continued to fall, washing the grime of the city from the concrete beneath our boots. For the first time in 12 years, the agonizing, heavy silence that had surrounded David's death was broken. The ghost was no longer a classified secret hidden in a redacted file. He was a presence standing between us, recognized, honored, and finally truly seen. I didn't smile, I didn't cry. I simply nodded, a slow, solemn acknowledgement of the truth that had finally stepped into the light. "My son's name is Elijah," I said quietly, the wind carrying the name into the storm, "and he has his father's eyes." The sterile, quiet corridors of Morgan Stanley Children's Hospital in Manhattan hummed with the soft, rhythmic sounds of medical machinery. It was a place where hope and fear fought a silent, daily war. For 7 years I had walked these halls with the hypervigilance of a soldier navigating a minefield. I knew the nurses by name. I knew the exact sound of the respiratory monitors. I knew the precise, suffocating weight of calculating which treatments I could afford and which ones I would have to beg the insurance company to reconsider. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, the air in the room felt entirely different. Elijah was sitting up in his hospital bed, a specialized IV line delivering a new, highly advanced muscle-preserving treatment into his small arm. He was reading a comic book, completely unbothered by the clinical environment. He had always possessed his father's quiet, uncomplaining bravery. There was a soft, respectful knock at the door. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my dark sweater. I was no longer wearing the faded thermal gear or the heavy canvas harness of a high-rise window washer. I was simply Maya Carter, a mother, a widow, an equal. The door opened and Marcus Bennett stepped inside. He did not bring an entourage of lawyers. He did not bring a photographer. He did not carry an oversized, performative check. The billionaire CEO of Bennett Defense Technologies had left his tailored suit jacket and silk tie behind. He wore a simple pressed button-down shirt, his sleeves rolled up to the forearms. He did not walk into the room as a powerful executive coming to bestow a blessing upon the unfortunate. He walked into the room as a man entering a sanctuary. Marcus looked at me first, offering a slow, profound nod of respect. Then his eyes moved to the bed. "Elijah," I said gently, stepping aside, "there is someone here to meet you." Elijah lowered his comic book. His dark, intelligent eyes studied the man standing at the foot of his bed. "Are you one of Mom's bosses?" he asked curiously. Marcus smiled, a genuine, deeply humbled smile. He slowly approached the bed, carefully pulling up a small plastic visitor's chair so he could sit at eye level with my son. He didn't tower over him. He lowered himself. "No, Elijah," Marcus answered, his voice rich and steady, completely devoid of corporate arrogance. "Actually, a long time ago, your father was my boss. He taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned." Elijah's eyes widened slightly. "You knew my dad?" "I did," Marcus said softly, the sorrow and profound gratitude weaving seamlessly into his tone. "He was the bravest man I ever met. He kept me safe when I was very scared, and I have spent a very long time looking for you and your mother so I could finally say thank you." I watched Marcus carefully. Wealthy men are accustomed to wielding their money as a weapon or a tool of leverage. But Marcus wasn't wielding anything. He was surrendering. After a few minutes of talking with Elijah about comic books and baseball, Marcus stood up and turned to me. "Maya, may I speak with you in the hall for a moment?" "Of course." I kissed Elijah's forehead and followed Marcus out into the quiet corridor. We stood near a large window overlooking the bustling streets of Manhattan. The freezing storm from a few days ago had entirely passed, leaving behind a crisp, brilliantly clear sky. Marcus reached into his pocket and handed me a single, sealed envelope. I didn't open it immediately. I looked at him, my posture straight, my dark eyes guarded. "I told you, Mr. Bennett, we do not need charity. And I told you, Mrs. Carter, I would never insult you with pity," Marcus replied instantly, his voice carrying the unwavering weight of a sacred vow. He gestured to the envelope. "Inside are the legal establishment documents for an irrevocable medical trust. It is fully funded. It will cover every single specialized treatment, every piece of mobility equipment, every specialist, and every experimental therapy Elijah will ever need for the rest of his life." My breath caught in my throat. My hands, which had gripped squeegees in freezing rain and hauled 100-pound rigs without trembling, suddenly felt weak. $6,500 a month. The suffocating, terrifying arithmetic that had governed my every waking moment for 7 years was vanishing in an instant. "Marcus," I started, the impenetrable armor of my discipline finally cracking just a fraction. Marcus held up a hand, his eyes burning with absolute, fierce conviction. "Maya, listen to me," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, undeniable truth. "I am not repaying your husband. There is absolutely nothing in this world that is enough to repay that debt." He paused, swallowing hard, the memory of the dark compound and the grenade flash clearly haunting his eyes. "But I can ensure that his son lives a life worthy of what his father protected," Marcus continued, repeating the vow he had made to himself 12 years ago. "David gave me my future. The very least I can do is secure Elijah's." I looked down at the envelope. I did not break into hysterical, grateful tears. I did not fall to my knees. A soldier does not weep when reinforcements finally arrive. They simply acknowledge that the line has held. I backed up at Marcus, offering a slow, deeply respectful nod. "Thank you for honoring his mission." "There is one more thing," Marcus said, his expression shifting from solemn gratitude to sharp, professional focus. He didn't look at me like a grieving widow anymore. He looked at me like an executive evaluating top-tier talent. "For 12 years, the Bennett Foundation has poured millions into military family aid. We have the capital, but frankly, we lack the operational ground truth. My board is filled with civilians who don't understand the psychological and bureaucratic warfare veterans face when they come home," Marcus explained. He took a step closer, establishing a baseline of absolute equality. "I don't want to just write checks, Maya. I want the foundation to operate with the same relentless, uncompromising discipline that you apply to your own life. I need an operator running the mission." I narrowed my eyes slightly. "What are you proposing?" "I am officially offering you the position of co-director of the Bennett Foundation," Marcus said clearly, the offer hanging in the bright hallway. I stared at him. The magnitude of the shift was tectonic. Just days ago I had been an invisible laborer, hanging from a nylon rope, scrubbing dirt from the glass of his ivory tower. Now he wasn't offering me a lifeline to escape poverty. He wasn't giving me a token job out of guilt. He was offering me the keys to his philanthropic empire. He was recognizing the unyielding steel in my spine, the tactical brilliance I possessed, and the profound, dignified resilience that had kept my son alive. He was elevating me from a beneficiary to an equal, a true reversal of status. I looked out the window at the skyline I had risked my life to clean. I thought about the thousands of widows, the broken veterans, the struggling single mothers who were fighting the same silent, desperate war I had been fighting. I knew their terrain, I knew their pain, and now I had the arsenal to fight for them. I turned back to Marcus. I didn't smile with overwhelming subservient gratitude. I gave him the sharp, focused look of a commander accepting a new theater of operations. "I expect full operational autonomy over the veteran outreach programs," I said, my voice smooth and authoritative. Marcus actually smiled, a brilliant, relieved smile. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Director Carter." 3 months later, the brutal, freezing winter had entirely surrendered to a vibrant, blooming spring. The air in Central Park was warm, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms and freshly cut grass. The sounds of the city, the blaring taxi horns and the grinding construction, were muffled by the thick canopy of ancient oak trees. I sat on a wooden park bench, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting dancing, golden shadows across my lap. I was no longer wearing faded thermals. I wore a beautifully tailored cream blazer. My phone buzzed occasionally with emails regarding multi-million-dollar grant approvals for military housing initiatives, but I ignored it. Today was a Saturday. Today belonged entirely to my son. Elijah was sitting beside me on the bench, his legs swinging gently. The new treatments, fully funded by the trust, had already begun to ease the chronic pain in his joints. There was a healthy, vibrant flush to his cheeks that I hadn't seen in years. He was eating a pretzel, watching a group of children chase a stray dog across the great lawn. I leaned back against the wooden slats, closing my eyes for a brief moment. For the first time in 12 years, my shoulders were not carrying the crushing, paralyzing weight of survival. The war was over. The perimeter was secure. I opened my eyes and looked down at my right arm. I had pushed the sleeve of my blazer up to enjoy the warmth of the sun. The monochrome black ink, the dagger piercing the falcon, rested peacefully against my skin. It no longer felt like a heavy, tragic memorial. It felt like a badge of honor. Elijah finished his pretzel and wiped his hands on a napkin. He looked over, his dark eyes landing on my forearm. He had seen the tattoo thousands of times, but I had always deflected his questions. I had always told him it was just a picture from the Navy. I was too afraid that if I spoke about David, the grief would swallow me whole, and I wouldn't be able to stay strong enough to keep Elijah alive. But I didn't need to be strong in the dark anymore. We were sitting in the light. "Mom?" Elijah asked softly, pointing a small finger at my arm. "Did Dad have that picture on his arm too?" I didn't tense up. I didn't change the subject. I looked at the ink, and then I looked at my beautiful, brave son. "He did, Eli," I said softly, my voice carrying no sorrow, only a profound, unshakable pride. "It was the symbol of our unit. The falcon means we watch over the people who need us, and the dagger means we never ever back down from a fight." Elijah's eyes widened with quiet awe. "Marcus said Dad was a hero, that he saved him." "Marcus was right," I replied, wrapping my arm around his small shoulders and pulling him close against my side. For the first time in 12 years, I didn't tell my son that his father had died. I didn't tell him about the folded flag, or the redacted files, or the agonizing silence of the military liaison. Instead, under the warm canopy of Central Park, I finally told my son the truth about how his father lived. "Your dad wasn't just a hero because he was strong, Eli," I whispered, the sunlight warming our faces. "He was a hero because he always knew exactly what the right thing to do was. Even when it was terrifying, even when it cost him everything, he chose to protect someone who couldn't protect himself." I kissed the top of Elijah's head, watching the wind rustle through the green leaves above us. "He made the bravest choice a person can make," I continued, my voice steady, peaceful, and completely unbroken. "And because he made that choice, he saved Marcus. And because he saved Marcus, Marcus was able to help save you." Elijah leaned his head against my chest, his small hand resting over my arm, his fingers gently brushing against the wings of the falcon. "So Dad is still protecting us?" Elijah asked innocently. A single quiet tear, not of pain but of absolute transcendent peace, slipped down my cheek, catching the sunlight before it fell. "Yes, my sweet boy," I whispered into the warm spring air, looking up at the endless, brilliant blue sky that stretched out over the city. "He never stopped."